Good evening. Welcome to show number 70 of In Harmony with Nature. I'm your host, Shalom Mandaville. This show and the next show will form parts of a very important presentation which will be called as the Geological and Geochemical Studies of Halifax Harbour, which also includes the Bedford Basin and the Bedford Bay. And the gentleman in charge of that study is Dr. Dale Buckley of Bedford Institute of Oceanography, who has been in the media quite a bit in the last 12 to 24 months. And he's also the head of a major study which has contributed some very eye-opening aspects for the Dr. Fournier Harbour Task Force study. Dr. Buckley possesses a bachelor's degree from Acadia University in geology, a master's from University of Western Ontario in geochemistry, a pre-PhD from Southern California in colloidal chemistry and marine geology. And then he has a PhD from University of Alaska in marine sciences, and he's a specialist in the geochemistry of sediments and water. He has been with the BIO almost since 1962, I think, when he did acid-based research in the geochemistry and sedimentology. I think with that, Dr. Buckley, I'll give the floor over to you, because it'll be more like a lecture series as opposed to question-answer thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, we began our studies approximately 2 years ago, and some of the work that was done actually began before that, in which there were some samples collected from throughout Halifax Harbour. And the main interest that we had was in looking at the chemical aspects of the sediments, to look particularly at an area in Bedford Basin where we knew that there was a very poor circulation of water over the sediments and expected to find quite strongly reduced sediments. About a year and a half ago, we collected a series of samples in conjunction with the Department of the Environment and the Department of Fisheries and Oceans throughout the harbour system, all the way from Bedford Bay to the approaches to Halifax Harbour, out as far as the entrance to past the headlands. So we have now a series of samples which give us some picture of the condition of the bottom sediments throughout the harbour system. Now I'm going to illustrate some of the material with a series of photographs in some cases, and in some cases there will be graphic illustrations to give you some impression of what the condition of the bottom sediments are like in various parts of the harbour. It's quite easy to see even from this illustration that the harbour is a very complex system consisting of the Bedford Bay at the very northern end of the system, and the rather deep Bedford Basin, which is 65 meters deep in the middle, a very narrow section across where both of the bridges are located between Halifax and Dartmouth, and then a slightly broader section of the harbour approaching the southern part of the harbour, and then the broad open section to the south of McNabb's Island. Now I'll show you a series of air photographs of parts of the harbour. This one, of course, is at the town of Bedford, and it shows some of the work that was undertaken in that area and part of the development. The silt screen that is in place at this point is restricting the release of some of the silt from the works that are taking place in that area. You can see that the screen is quite successful in restricting that. In this illustration, you can see the effect of the Sackville River plume coming into Bedford Bay, and that turbid water at the northern end of the Bedford Bay is a result of unusual high runoff of fresh water. And whenever that happens, that brings down a fine layer of silt, which disperses at first in Bedford Bay, and then eventually a bit of it gets into the Bedford Basin. It remains a rather obvious brownish color when it first enters the system, because that's a reflection of how much the sediment has been oxidized. So you see later on, after that sediment has stayed on the bottom for some period of time, it will become a black mud. So it's originally red because it's oxidized, red or brown, and then it becomes black. And this is a view of the waterfront in the Halifax area, obviously, and you can see the effect of a plume coming out from the area of historic properties. This is where one of the well-known outfalls occurs in the Halifax waterfront. And a look at these plumes is fairly important because it tells us something about the direction of dispersion from the outfalls in the harbor. In this case, you can see that there is a dispersion more or less towards the south, going out of the harbor on the surface of the water. And this is another well-known major outfall, what we call Pier A. There are two actually in that area, and those two outfalls discharge a large volume of domestic sewage mainly. That's also an area where bulk loading of the vessels takes place from the Dover flour loading facilities, and the wharfs here are just to the north of the container pier. You can see the plume in the water which extends out well beyond the wharf. I'll refer back to this later in some other illustrations where you can see the effects of this material when it arrives on the bottom. This is another aerial view. In this case, it's very near the Tufts Cove electrical generating plant. And you can see here very clear dispersion plume from one of the outfalls located near the power plant. This particular outfall changes character very rapidly and quite frequently through weekly cycles and monthly cycles, so it's not always as obvious as it is in this particular photograph. This is also an area of thermal effluent, that is heated water that is coming out from the plant, and a little later on I illustrate that with a short video which you'll see from that was taken from underwater, so you can see now in this case the surface view of it, and a little later on we'll show you what that looks like underwater. Now this gives some idea of the sources of contamination that might be entering the harbor system, but that's not the entire story. Halifax Harbour is a rather unique system as a geographic inlet because of this Bedford Basin. And you can see on this map the deep part of Bedford Basin is quite unique. Most of the rest of the harbor is around 20 meters deep. Even the main channel is around 20 meters deep, but in the center of Bedford Basin it goes down to almost 70 meters. And that's quite a large area, and that has made it, of course, a very strategic harbor. If you look very carefully through the narrow section of the harbor, that is the area near Tufts Cove and Duffus Street, you'll see a central channel which sort of meanders through that system and goes out past George's Island, past Point Pleasant, and out towards Herring Cove. That's the old submerged riverbed of the Sackville River. So one time, approximately 6,000 years ago, the Sackville River actually ran into a lake, which was Bedford Basin, and then out through the Narrows and through the harbor as a riverbed. That's a fairly important knowledge to have about the prehistory of this area, because when one studies the cores of sediments that are in Bedford Basin, you find that you go through a marine sequence, and then eventually, if you go deep enough in the sediments, you actually encounter lake sediments, which, as I say, are about 6,000 years old.
It's fascinating.
Now, this is a view of some of the outfalls that occur. There are over 40 main outfalls in the peninsula area of Halifax and Dartmouth. These black arrows show a number of these, and highlighted in red are some of the main outfalls which are emptying into that area. And the ones which I will refer to in some of the data that you'll see a little later on are the ones that are coming in from Tufts Cove, for instance, where I showed you a view of the surface plume a little while ago. The main outfall that goes off of Duffus Street, which is a fairly recent consolidated outfall. That is, that it has collected the sewers in the north end of Halifax and in Rockingham area, and its main release point is just at Duffus Street. The other areas which are of importance are the CFB Halifax area. They're another major outfall area in that section, plus a fair bit of contamination, as you'll see a little later on, from what we think is some of the industrial activity that has taken place there. Over on the other side, in Dartmouth Cove, there are at least 2 main outfalls that are discharging sewage into that area, and you'll see the effects of that on the maps of the bottom sediment characteristics. Then coming again across to the Halifax side, the Pier A site that I showed a few minutes ago with the aerial photographs, you can see those are located right at the in or under the Pier A. Then there's another main collective outfall which goes off of Point Pleasant. And that actually collected up a number of the older sewer lines that used to go into Northwest Arm along most of its reach. So the areas outside of Point Pleasant don't have any major collector lines until you get down to the Herring Cove area. And on the Eastern Passage side, there's not one shown there, but there is, in fact, a small outfall area from the Eastern Passage sewage treatment plant. What I haven't shown on this map is that the town of Bedford also has a release point that is significant in terms of the effect on the sediments. Now I'll show you a few photographs of what the bottom sediments look like in each of these areas. This particular sample is what we call a grab sample. It's taken with a device that's lowered to the bottom and simply closes a set of jaws on the bottom sediment. And this particular sample was taken from the center of Bedford Bay. If you remember a little while ago, I mentioned about the brownish-colored sediments that come in from the Sackville River. Well, this is not very far away from the Sackville River itself, but the mud here is very black. And the reason for that is that the sediments are pretty much deprived of any oxygen. And that's because of the abundance of organic material that's in the sediments. If a sediment has a great deal of organic matter, that is vegetable matter or plant matter, then it can consume the oxygen that's in the water that's in contact with it, just in the same way as material might burn on the surface of the earth. The oxygen can be depleted by a great mat of organic matter at the bottom. When that happens, then the sediment becomes black. And this is what you can see here. It's very clear that the oxygen has been pretty much depleted in this sediment. This is another example of this, and this is from the Northwest Arm. Here you can see that the sediment is very fine grain. The term that's used for this is black mayonnaise. It's a black, organic-rich, very fine-grained mud. A typical example of what happens when there is very little oxygen penetration into the sediments. Here's an example of the same texture of mud, but in this case there has been sufficient contact of oxygen in the overlying water with the sediments so that the muds actually become brown. This sample was taken from off of Sandwich Point. So the muds here don't have as much organic matter in them, and so there's an opportunity for the oxygen to oxidize the surface mud and turn it brown again. So one can, just by looking at the samples, you can get some idea of the conditions of the bottom sediments. Now this is another way of getting a view of what the bottom of the harbor looks like, and this is recorded with what we use as a surveying tool. It's a side-scanning sonar, and this is one side of the track of that device. Basically what it does is to send out an echo at an angle from a vehicle towed behind a ship, and the echo returns to the recorder and records almost like a shadow image. And there are several things that can be seen on this that are of great interest to us. First of all, in the more or less the left center part of the image, you can see a number of trails. These are anchor drag marks. Near this area is one of the main buoys that is located in the center of Bedford Basin where the ships can tie up. That buoy has been moved a number of times. It stays in position by being anchored to the bottom. So each time that the buoy is moved, the anchors are pulled in and it leaves a mark on the bottom. There are two other features which are quite a historic interest, if nothing else. Over to the right center part of the image, you can see a rectangular mark on the recording. That's a barge that we have known about for a number of years, and that was located by a side-scanning sonar device quite a number of years before this particular recording. What was new to us when some of these recordings were made was the image over again on the left-hand side, which looks very much like a sailboat hull. That vessel turned out to be a dragger that was scuttled in that area sometime in the early 60s. But we didn't know that at the time we took this image. In fact, there was quite a bit of speculation that this might be the hull of a schooner because of the shape of it. It looked very much like a schooner hull. So from these devices, you can obtain a great deal of information about what we call the geomorphology, that is the shape of the bottom of the harbor. And you can see the effects of man's activity, in this case by the anchor drag marks. And you can see the debris left from disposal of a number of pieces of man's activity. These furrow marks are quite important from some of the things that we'll be talking about a little later on. That is that these furrows tend to turn over the sediments. So if there is a contaminant in the sediments and an anchor is dragged through that contaminant, it will tend to stir it up and destroy the normal kind of relationship where you have the most recent material on the top and the older material underneath. So it's something that has to be taken into consideration when we're doing some interpretation of the stratigraphic relationship of contaminants in the sediments. Now, I have a short video which I can show, which is taken from what we call a remote operated vehicle. It's a vehicle that is lowered into the water and acts essentially like a mechanical scuba diver. So it can be used to carry cameras and sampling devices, a number of different instruments to measure the condition of the bottom. In this case, I'm showing a short section of a traverse that was taken off of Tufts Cove. You can see that the water is very turbid. There is material passing in front of the camera, and the bottom is littered with various types of small organisms. This is a bit different than what we would see as we move a little closer to the thermal plume. Here you can see that there are some actually benthic organisms attached to a rock. These animals and plants are not normally found in Bedford Basin or in Halifax Harbour, and they would not be here if it wasn't for the effect of the higher temperature water coming from the thermal plume from the electrical generating station. Now we move across the narrow section to the Duffus Street outfall, and this is rather a unique image of what the area looks like next to a main sewer outfall. Here you can see that the water is actually fairly clear, that is relatively, but there's a lot of debris on the bottom, a very coarse debris, and it includes everything from plastic to bits of paper and solid particles. But this area has fairly good penetration of light, and so some of the fish life can actually get in underneath these outfalls. The unique thing about them is that this, by the way, is the mechanical arm on the row of vehicle, and it can be used to pick up samples from the bottom. It surprised us that some of the finfish that had moved into this area seemed to be taking advantage of the particular habitat. But as you move away from the outfall, you get into areas where there's more and more debris falling out. Here you can see what I think is some type of flatfish. I'm not a biologist, so I don't know the species names for these.
So the harbor is not dead?
No, not by long ways. And in fact, some organisms actually take advantage, as I say, of the rich nutrient supply near some of these sewage outfall areas. In this particular case, we're actually moving up the mound of debris that has been deposited from the sewer outfall. And we have a short clip of what the area looks like when you move away from that and move out further where some of this fine debris begins to fall. So it's like an umbrella. The first view of this is getting in underneath the umbrella, and now we'll turn away and move out into the area where the debris is beginning to fall down through the water column. Some of this debris in this last shot was caused by the movement of the rowed vehicle itself. Here you'll see some white patches on the bottom. This is actually a bacterial colony, and it's very instructive to us because it's telling us that this is a reducing bacteria. That is, it's a bacteria that lives where there's no oxygen. And so the substrate or the sediments underneath this are very much depleted in oxygen. And we think that the nutrient source here, or the energy source for this bacteria, is sulfur-based. That is, that it's material that is generating its life cycle from non-oxygen environments.
Where is the sulfur coming from?
There's always sulfate in seawater, but when it becomes reduced, it goes to sulfur or sulfides. And so below this mud surface, once the reduction has taken place, there's plenty of sulfur in a reduced state. So this is quite characteristic of areas that have a high gradient from an oxygen environment down through to a reducing environment. And again, you can see as the vehicle begins to back up that a lot of this debris is very easily resuspended. Now, that sort of gives us a descriptive view of the harbor. Now perhaps we can take a little bit more of an analytical view of the harbor. And as I mentioned, in 1986 and in 1988, a series of samples were taken throughout the harbor system, in fact, nearly 300 samples, extending all the way from Bedford Bay out through to off of Herring Cove and over to the other side of the Eastern Passage and out to Hartland Point. So we have a fairly dense coverage of samples that extends throughout this area. One of the things that a geochemist particularly looks at is the texture of the sediments because that tells something about the potential for the sediments to hold contaminants. And here in this illustration we are just simply showing where the mud content is very high. We define mud as being very fine-grained. If you were to pick up something which was 100% mud, you would feel just a very fine grit in your fingers. That is, that the particles would all be less than 0.06 millimeters in diameter. And then above that would be what we call sand. And you can see that sections of the Bedford Basin and Bedford Bay, in fact, have a very high percentage of that kind of sediment. But there's an interesting anomaly in Bedford Basin as well. Just off of CBO Point, you can see that there's an area where there is more sandy material. That is, that the mud content is less. Another area of interest is the narrow section of the harbor, and you can see that there's very little mud in that area. That is, that it's less than 40% or 30% through the area by Duffus Street and Tufts Cove. And that section more or less where the McKay Bridge crosses, almost down to where the McDonald Bridge is located. The reason that there's probably less mud in that area is because that's an area where the harbor is constricted, so the tidal currents are much stronger. So it would be difficult for fine-grained material to settle to the bottom in that area. Then as you go out into the broader section of the harbor, you can see that the mud content increases again, and there's a tongue of mud which extends almost down into Eastern Passage, another one off of Point Pleasant, and fairly high mud contents throughout the Northwest Arm. But the mud content decreases somewhat as you go offshore, but you can almost see the old Sackville River bed as it goes out past Herring Cove. Now the second constituent that we look very carefully at is the concentration of organic carbon. This is a carbon that is related to living material. That is, that the carbon either comes from plant or animal debris. And normally, if one were to measure the organic carbon content in sediments from a harbor that hadn't been affected by man, that is, it just had simply the natural runoff from the land, you would normally find something less than 2 or 3% of organic carbon in those sediments, unless some other condition had increased it, like in a bog. But here we see almost throughout the whole harbor system that the concentration of organic carbon is quite high. In a few samples, we got up as high as 13% organic carbon, and that's a surprising amount of organic carbon. The only reason that that kind of high organic carbon content can exist is because it's not being consumed by the oxidation. That is, that the oxygen is not burning up the organic material that goes in. You can see again that Bedford Bay, Bedford Basin have very high organic carbon contents, and that's an area where there is, in the bottom water only, there is very little oxygen. So the organic carbon that falls into that part of the basin stays there. Then through the narrow section of the harbor and off of CFB Halifax down past, in fact, where the McDonald Bridge is located, again, there's very high organic carbon content. And that's quite unusual because that's an area where the mud content isn't particularly high. Normally one doesn't see that. Usually one sees where there's high organic carbon content, there's also a high mud content. In this case, the organic carbon content is high in spite of the fact that there's very little mud. You can also see a tongue of high organic rich sediments coming out of Dartmouth Cove. Another one out from Pier A. And remember, those are two areas where there are major outfalls. And another one off of Point Pleasant Park, which extends all the way up through the Northwest Arm. And that's an area that's being loaded with outfall material from the sewers. An interesting point here is that the organic carbon content doesn't extend offshore, that is, out towards the Herring Cove area, to the extent that the mud does. And that's very instructive because that's telling us that if we assume that most of the organic carbon we're looking at in these sediments is coming from the sewers, that much of it is not getting offshore, that it's staying pretty much inside the harbor system. Now we'll look at a few metals that we consider to be quite diagnostic of what we might call, we use a big word for it, anthropogenic effects. That is, that these are effects from man's activity. And copper is one of the metals that we use to measure that kind of effect. And going from the left to the right in this illustration, you can see that there is a high concentration of copper near the town of Bedford. Another very high concentration in sort of the north-central part of Bedford Basin.
Dr. Buckley, we have about roughly 3/4 a minute left. So if you can wrap it up and continue in the next show.
Okay. So these anomalous patterns can tell us something about where there are points of entry of contaminants from sewers or from solid waste. And we'll talk more about that in the second program.
Okay. Well, I thank you very much, and I invite all the listeners to tune into the next show next week because it's a very fascinating thing. And thank you.